Michelle Hurn, welcome to the Soccer Queens podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
I am really looking forward to this discussion because I have your book right here, The Dietitian's Dilemma. And man, is this going to be controversial for a lot of my listeners because a lot of people who listen to this podcast are female soccer coaches, parents, and also players, mainly teenage female soccer athletes. And they've been blasted with very mainstream nutrition advice. And I love hearing your perspective because it is a little bit different than the norm. But before we get into all of that, why don't you give a background on who you are and what you're up to today?
Yeah. So my background, I am a registered dietitian. I became a dietitian in 2009. Actually ended up leaving healthcare due to some health issues and some other things, and we can certainly dive into that. Right now I've got a lot of irons in the fire. I am currently writing a children's book on type 2 diabetes. I do some private consulting. I do some sales and marketing. I'm also an ultra runner, so I compete in distances over 26 miles. So that takes a lot of my time as far as endurance training. And yeah, it's my goal just to continue to spread nutrition, actual nutrition. How do I put this? Truths, which is very hard to find. Unfortunately, most people, even very well-meaning people, have just been kind of flooded with propaganda and things that aren't necessarily true or healthy for the human body.
So I want you to start off with your story that kind of led you to finding these truths and what's really healthy to nourish your body with. You are recovering from an eating disorder, and you said that you used to pump your body with sugars and refined carbohydrates, and then you hit a breaking point and then made a shift. So can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my health journey really starts when I was 12. When I was 12 years old, I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. At that time, I was almost 5 feet tall and 57 and a half pounds. So, pretty actually passed out in school, ended up at the hospital and subsequently was sent to a 2 month long inpatient treatment. So, given a pretty grim chance of survival at that point, my heart rate was really low, kidney shutting down. I was put on a 24-hour tube feeding system, and the ingredients of the tube feeding system are the same. I mean, that's when I was 12. So fast forward, I'm now 40. So 28 years later, still the same ingredients: corn syrup, soy protein, maltodextrin. I was put on the standard American diet, and my calories were slowly bumped up. And, I was told, even as a 12-year-old, like, hey, if you do recover, you're most likely going to deal with this your entire life. You're going to have racing thoughts around food. You're going to deal with anxiety. You're going to deal with depression. You will probably always struggle with eating. So, yeah, even as a very young person, I was like, gosh, if I make it, I'm going to have to become just a high functioning human with an eating disorder. And, when I was in treatment, I was actually on 7 different medications because I was having so much, GI issues. And they were right. I was very anxious, dealt with depression, dealt with some OCD. But yeah, I did become weight restored. I was able to gain weight. I was able to go back to school, start participating in sports. But like I said, I always struggled with anxiety and depression. And I wanted to become a dietitian. I think a lot of people kind of shift and choose their health careers based on not only wanting to kind of heal yourself, but also help other people. But yeah, as soon as I, entered the dietetics field, to be a dietitian, you get your 4-year degree and then you go on to an internship. Things just didn't make sense. We'd go into the room of somebody with type 2 diabetes, and my preceptor would just be like, oh, yeah, we're going to teach them how to eat carbohydrates throughout the day and dose insulin throughout the day. And I remember as a student just asking questions like, oh, wow, I think their blood sugar is high, right? So should we have them eat less carbohydrates? And it's like, no, I was kind of pegged as a difficult dietetic student. It was just, the dogma was you have to have carbohydrates all the time. It doesn't matter if you're overweight, underweight, kidney failure, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. And same thing, we go into the ICU, and I remember seeing, like, I just spoke about those tube feeding ingredients, and like, wow, should we really be feeding patients who can't eat like this, basically straight sugar, oils, and, soy protein? But I was told, hey, it's just all about calories in, calories out. Carbohydrates are the foundation of human nutrition. And then at the time too, I was a runner. I'd become an athlete. And so as you alluded to, I was eating a lot of carbohydrates. But I wasn't, I certainly wouldn't say I was eating super clean, but I ate oatmeal and sweet potatoes and mostly whole food carbohydrates. I certainly had granola bars and desserts and things because I was taught that the best way for athletes to perform is super high carbohydrate, a little bit of lean protein, as many fruits and vegetables as you can handle, and that's pretty much how I ate. And I had a lot of success in the running world, but had all kinds of aches and pains and a severe anxiety, severe episodes of depression. And yeah, it wasn't really until 2019 when I kind of had my own personal health crash that I, completely changed how I ate, and that led me to where I am today.
Now, I'm curious, why were you the only dietitian really questioning a lot of the mainstream nutrition advice?
I think when you're a student, when you're young, it's hard. The Academy of Nutrition, the governing board of all dietitians, is heavily sponsored by processed foods. Like it seems like a conflict of interest to me, but the number one sponsors of the Academy of Nutrition are like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Frito-Lay. And so dietitians are taught. We are taught, not just taught, but it's literally hammered in your head over and over and over again that all foods can fit, all things in moderation. And so yeah, I think people just, one, they don't question it. Two, I think that you know, eating sugar and eating things that we inherently know, certainly in large quantities, are bad for you. Or, we in this country, we have an issue of obesity and type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Most people don't associate that with poor health, like we would say, like, cigarettes or some other, or, alcoholism or something like that. So, uh, yeah, it's very interesting. It is curious to me that we don't have more dietitians questioning our current nutrition paradigm. Because you think of anything else, think of like, if you if you were building houses and 70% of houses were crashing or breaking apart, you would think that most people would be asking like, man, we really need to look at how we're constructing these houses. And we live in a country where 70% of people are either overweight or obese, where obesity is increasing exponentially. Major depression, bipolar disorder, OCD is increasing. Like, I think it's fair to take a step back and say we really need to question how we're fueling and feeding ourselves.
Let's get into the macronutrients. And one way your book kind of started off with a bang, and I was like, oh, this is going to really ruffle some feathers here. But you list protein, fat, and carbohydrates, and you say that proteins and fats are essential and carbohydrates are not essential. Can you go into why that is the case and some ways carbohydrates can wreak havoc on the body?
Yes, and I do want to preface too that I'm not anti-carbohydrate. I've had people come and ask like, "Oh, you're an athlete and you don't eat carbohydrates." That is not true. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's start with what you talked about. So, um, I always like to appeal to common sense, because in this country, and if you go on social media, I feel like you see so many things that are just, they're not true. But people get, they're not reading the articles, people get outraged. So when it comes how to humans evolved, what our bodies need to feel good, to perform, to live, to thrive, to not get sick, we evolved eating meat and fat. We literally evolved eating the megafauna. We, throughout evolution, plants were very small, bitter, had almost no nutritional value. They were literally eaten as like fillers, like just to give your stomach something when there was famine. So animal protein and fat are the most highly bioavailable. They contain the most highly bioavailable nutrition, meaning your body can utilize and absorb that very well. That's what your body needs to live, to thrive. Can you live and thrive? Can you live off other things? Absolutely. But can you thrive off them? No. But as far as, we have things called essential amino acids for protein. If you do not get those, your body will start to break apart. And the human body is amazing. Like, it will do everything it can to possibly stay alive. You could eat no protein for a period of time and, your body would break down muscle. It would do all kinds of things to keep you, alive. But if you followed a zero protein diet for a very prolonged period of time, you would eventually die. You have to have amino acids. Same thing with fat. That's why it's called essential fatty acids. You need those to build hormones, to fat soluble vitamins D, E, A, and K. You actually have to have fat to absorb those. That's important in bone health. That's important in your immune system. That's important in blood clotting. When it comes to carbohydrates, there's no essential carby acid or essential carbohydrate, meaning you can eat zero carbohydrates throughout your entire life and be just fine. And you could argue if you're eating animal protein, you're going to get some carbohydrates because you're going to be eating the muscle glycogen that the animal has. But the point being that there's really no vitamin, mineral, nutrient that you can't get in animal protein and fat that you would absolutely 100% need to get to live and thrive. And that's why we see people on like carnivore diets, just animal based protein that have been doing it 5 years, 10 years plus. People on very strict ketogenic diets, really high fat, high protein, been doing it for their whole life and they live and thrive very well. When we see people remove animal protein from their diet, especially if they just follow, these fruits, these fruitarian juice diets, unfortunately there was just a woman who died doing that. It's tragic. So once again, it's the human body, the foundation of human nutrition. Do you want, especially for young humans, do you want to build muscle? Do you want to make sure you're strong? Do you want to make sure your hormones are functioning correctly? You have enough iron, so you can have energy. You're able to sleep well. Your brain has enough neurotransmitters to learn. If you're going to college, if you're and so you can actually shut it off, so you can sleep and not be anxious. These are all things that are very important, eating enough proteins and fats.
That's super interesting because whenever I go on Instagram, I see dietitians saying to athletes, especially, hey, you need to have your gel pack every few hours. You need to fuel with fruit snacks. I've seen you have to have 400 grams of carbohydrates for breakfast if you're a high level soccer player. So now my question is, can athletes perform at a high level on a low carbohydrate and high fat, high animal protein based diet?
See, that's so nuanced. So my initial answer is yes, but I think it's very nuanced. So for somebody like me, who is an ultra endurance athlete, my sport is very non glycolytic, meaning I'm not out there doing sprints. I am teaching my body to burn as much fat for fuel as possible. For somebody like a soccer player who's doing a lot of very high intensity sprints, running quite a bit where they're going to be at a super high heart rate, can they perform well at a super, super duper like ketogenic diet? I would say no, probably not. But on the flip side, I would say, for any athlete, my nephew is a type 1 diabetic and a soccer player. that what we do, the pendulum swings both ways, right? So people, as you stated earlier, dietitians saying you need 400 grams of carbohydrates for breakfast. That's a terrible idea. That not only is going to make you potentially feel sick, that's going to, when you eat that many carbohydrates, you're going to crowd out, your ability to eat some protein and fat. That's going to be stored as fat, which if you're a young, healthy person may not be a bad idea, but over time, that's not going to be great. You might get a blood sugar, crash. You're going to feel kind of dizzy, shaky later. So, for young athletes, I think that what makes the most sense is to really prioritize protein and fat and then utilize carbohydrates in relation to how active you are. So for someone who's young and active, having 150, 200 grams of carbohydrates is probably just fine, maybe even necessary, to where you structure it around your training. Then the rest of your day, making sure you get a lot of healthy fat. The women, especially young women, they're restricting fat, and that is a recipe for bone issues. That's a recipe for hormonal problems. So, I guess that's a long way of answering your question. That maybe not a low carbohydrate diet for our glycolytic athletes, like our soccer athletes, but a much lower than what they're potentially prescribing, and then structuring it to where you have your carbohydrates around your training for, training and recovery, and then focusing on protein and fat the other times of the day.
I love that, focusing on the protein and the fat, and I like the idea of using the carbohydrates as rocket fuel. I believe you learned that from, was it Zach Bitter?
Yeah, my
Yeah,
coach.
I think that's so great. Are there any, carbohydrates that you would recommend that female athletes focus on for this rocket fuel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not super specific or too worried about carbohydrates as far as like, these ones are the best ones, whatever, because I really prioritize getting my nutrition that I know I need for my body, meaning that, the human body needs a certain amount of vitamins and minerals. And so I get so much of that from animal protein that when it comes to carbohydrates, I usually say like, what do you like, especially around activity? If you're out and you're running and you're competing, what settles in your stomach very easily, because it doesn't make any sense to be like, oh, have some blueberries and, and that makes that doesn't work in your stomach. But I do think ideally whole foods is the best, especially vitamin C is probably one of the few nutrients that, you really in the plant kingdom that it's only available in the plant kingdom. If you're eating just a purely animal based diet, there's some research that says, we could talk more about that, that you don't really need to supplement with vitamin C. But if you're active, I think getting some fresh fruit is great. I think, if you're going to do the starches, we do some long fermented sourdough, some rice, some sweet potatoes. Um, yeah. And then, I'm not, once again, if you're in competition and you're drinking some sports fuels, I think that's fine. I think, but you're using it strategically within competition, not all throughout the day type of thing.
Let's, come back to the mental health piece and
Sure.
why getting that high quality protein and fat is so crucial for brain health.
Yeah, I mean, it's multifaceted. Probably two of the things that I don't think a lot of people fully understand or appreciate are just how important certain vitamins and minerals are for the brain. Specifically, things like folate, B12, and then some of the cofactors and coenzymes like taurine, carnosine, things like that. Your brain needs those things to actually make neurotransmitters to for your brain to function, for your brain to actually, to respond, for you to be able to cope and deal with stress. We have right now, I would say, especially for young people, there's so much stress. When I was growing up, we didn't have social media and some of this other stuff. And so as we've moved away from eating these animal based foods, and we're replacing them with, either highly processed fake meat things or highly processed carbohydrates, we're seeing a huge decline in mental health. And I see so many health professionals being like, oh, it's social media and oh, it's all this. And yes, of course, those things can certainly have an impact. But, if you're not giving yourself the nutrition that your body and brain needs to function, you can't expect it to function well. So that's a big one. Really kind of embracing that not all proteins are created equal either. Animal protein, specifically like ruminant animals, beef, lamb, things like that, are just really, really high in the specific nutrients that your brain needs. And then on the flip side, as in society, as we've started eating more and more carbohydrates, and this is interesting because if you ask the average person, a lot of people, I worked in the clinic as a dietitian for 11 years. They're like, oh, I don't eat many carbohydrates. And then you walk through their diet. It's like, well, I have some oatmeal for breakfast, and then I have a coffee, a mocha, then I have pasta for lunch, and then I have a sandwich, so they don't, I don't think a lot of people realize how many carbohydrates, they're eating throughout the day. But when you eat a ton of processed carbohydrates, that can actually shift the neurotransmitters in your brain, one specifically glutamate and GABA. And, most people understand like dopamine and a few of those others, but aren't as familiar with glutamate and GABA. And we know now, we have some pretty good research that people who are eating a lot of processed carbohydrates, and these can even be things like granola bars and, cookies and cereal, over time, that can actually shift that balance in your brain to where your brain is actually no longer able to participate in neuroplasticity, meaning your brain can't mold, can't change, can't take in new information. So if you're guy, if you're trying to learn a skill, a sport, overcoming an addiction, all these different things, you need to be able to think, to change, to mold your brain. And I would hypothesize that might be another reason we're seeing such a high rate of, depression and anxiety in our young people, Like, life is hard. You need to be able to process, to change, to to do things. And so much of our health is what we eat. And I think we've just taken that really for granted.
One thing that I really like about the high protein, high fat way of living is it really satisfies you and you feel nourished. And I think for young teenage girls who have a bad relationship with food, it can really help them to feel full and not constantly like think about their next meal. And I'm just wondering, is there any like new research coming up on this type of eating, putting eating disorders into remission or like completely changing relationships with food?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually had a really good case study on binge eating disorder and bulimia. Dr. Sethi Shabani published, and you nailed it. Just eating protein and fat is very satiating. There are very different hormones that are released when you eat protein and fat versus carbohydrates. And that's one of the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, we've made in human nutrition. Is just saying, oh, here's 200 calories of a bagel or 200 calories of eggs. They're the same. It's like these have vastly different impacts on the hormones in your body. And so what we have found, and I guess I should back up, this is very controversial. You want to get dietitians like all in a fluster, say suggest this. I actually co-wrote a study with Dr. Norwitz on anorexia and therapeutically restrictive carbohydrate diets for anorexia. So basically, a very high fat, high animal protein diet. And we saw people with anorexia go into remission. I mean, these were people with 20 plus years. I got to interview a woman who was had an 8-year-old son and had decided to commit suicide. Like she was that so sick, had been just in and out of hospitals with anorexia. I mean, BMI down to 13, just didn't want to live and came across, a very high animal protein diet and was kind of like, well, I have nothing to lose. Might as well try it. And so, you know, it sounds good on the outside, right? If a dietitian saying like, oh my God, you can't ask somebody with a dysfunctional relationship with food to quote unquote restrict carbohydrates or restrict flour, restrict sugar. But that completely underlines what those do in our body and brain. I think we have to accept and wrap our head around that some people, not everybody, but a lot of people, when they eat flour and they eat sugar, they either cannot stop, they binge, they might purge, or it just causes this cascade of negative effects, whether that's anxiety, whether that's depression. Thus, a lot of people will restrict. That was me. Like I've always been relatively lean. I didn't binge and purge, but I restricted. And, as an athlete, when I was eating a lot of carbohydrates, I had severe anxiety. I was on all kinds of medication. I had panic attacks but I continued to eat a lot of these foods because like, oh, I got to fuel my activity. Oh, it's the foundation of human nutrition. And so when I decided to initially adopt a, very high animal protein, no carbohydrate, high animal fat diet for a while, you know, my wife was like, this is eating disorder. This is terrible. This is going to hurt you." And we found the opposite, within several weeks, my mental health. I mean, she literally said like, "This is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you." Um, and we're seeing this, with a lot of people, like I said, with eating disorders, because all of a sudden you're stabilizing blood sugar. You're not having that spike of, once you have carbohydrates that spike and crash. Just doing that can actually massively help anxiety. But then you're actually giving your body, you're flooding your body with all these macronutrients, and you're getting macro and micro, the protein, fat, vitamins, and minerals, and you're allowing your brain to function. And so I want to caveat, it's not I mean, unfortunately, you can take any way of eating and make it restrictive. But for people, like with the case study with 3 people with very severe anorexia, they were able to go from, that one lady BMI of 13, which, to put, I guess, in perspective, I want to say she was like 5'7" and like 80 pounds, like pretty sick. To, now up to 140 pounds, now eating, at some points 5,000 plus calories a day, eating lots of butter, eating lots of everything, the opposite of what human nutrition tells you to eat. And, we're able to heal themselves. So I think our take home message is for health, structuring your eating in a way that's going to support your body and your brain is always where you should start. when you eat the meats and fats, when you start eating these real foods, it's almost kind of amazing to me that as a society, we've kind of wrapped our, we've said like, hey, let's starting your day with Cheerios and, toast and God, this big glass of juice is like a good way to start your day. Like all these, more processed foods, but don't eat these real foods that are full of nutrition and will keep you satiated. So wrapping your head
Right.
around like the real human nutrition, getting back to eating real animal foods is the best way to formulate your diet. And then from there, like you said, then you start to really build out like, how can I make sure I'm fueling my activity?
One thing I really loved about this is you do eat like double or triple the calories that you normally consume, but you don't really feel any shame around it. You're just like, no, like I needed that. I can intuitively eat because I know my body needs this and I'm getting all the nutrients that I need. And it's so easy and you're also not thinking about your next meal so much because it's just like, okay, I'm going to have steak today and probably the same thing tomorrow and it's like very simple and you don't have to constantly like overthink everything.
I think that was one of the beautiful things for me is my whole life, I like to kind of describe it that I felt like I was really standing on the sidelines of my life for a lot of my early adolescence and early adulthood, because you eat and then it's like, well, I just ate it, it was 9 a.m. and it's 11. I'm kind of hungry. Should I eat? Do I need a granola bar? You're always thinking about your next meal. And, for me as well, thinking like, ah, shoot, did I eat too much? Well, I got to fuel my activity. Did I eat enough? And when I first transitioned to eating just a lot of protein and fat, first it was a little weird. I'm the only dietitian. I was still working at the hospital when I first started. Everyone's eating bagels and whatever. And I'm here with my pound of ground beef for breakfast. They're like, oh, that's different. But yeah, it was very interesting. Like it was almost, I can't even describe it. You alluded to it, just feeling very satisfied, like, it was okay, like, I was eating, several thousand calories, and I was fine. But, yeah, it was kind of like an aha moment for me. I remember we had kind of an all-hospital meeting, and I was sitting next to one of my dietitian coworkers, and she was super fidgety, and she was just like, "Okay, I gotta get a snack. Do you need a snack?" And I was just like, "Hey, Christy, well, we're gonna eat lunch at noon, like, it's cool." And she's like, "Michelle, it's almost 2." And in no universe, when I was a high carb athlete, could I have gone like 6 hours without eating. I was eating like every 2 hours. If not, I'd become dizzy, shaky, whatever. And so I think that's a really good sign that your metabolism is healed, that your blood sugar is stable, is, you should be able to go several hours without eating. You shouldn't have to feel, not saying that if you're burning a ton of calories, you can't have a snack or whatever. But if you can't go for more than 2 hours without feeling dizzy and shaky, like that's not a good sign. When you eat lots of protein and fat, you're able to go 4, 6 plus hours and not just feel like, I'm going to have a mental breakdown if I don't get a snack. So yeah, that was, and yeah, it was interesting how my relationship to food really improved. I used to avoid butter. I didn't eat egg yolks. Steak was more of a treat. We had a lot of chicken, a lot of white fish, to where now it was just like, man, we're going through a stick of butter a day. I'm eating all this, really high fat stuff. I was sleeping better. I felt like I was almost seeking out fattier cuts of meat. It, it was very healing. And I think you would find that same premise with a lot of people who had gone from, more of an eating disorder background to eating a lot more fat to like, wow, I just finally felt like I was nourishing my body.
It's so funny because it's like, if I can have bacon, eggs, butter, ribeye, like sign me up for this. This is so amazing. But then you see I believe it's the myplate.gov and the idea of the balanced meal. You got to have like half a plate of grains, a quarter a plate of the protein, and then I think a quarter of the plate veggies, and then like a side of fruit and like all this extra stuff. And it's like, wait, do I really need this? So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like most dietitians, I'm certainly would tell you, like, oh, you have to eat these fruits and veggies. And, most, a lot of plants are actually, like, it seems almost like, blasphemous, but a lot of plants are not that good for you. Things like chard and kale, a lot of those things, and grains, they've got fiber, they've got things that specifically bind to things like iron and calcium, and the actual vitamins and minerals in plants are not very absorbable. Like, meaning, I like to use the analogy, like, if you took like steak and you took like, spinach, if you took the exact same amount. So let's say, they have, 200 calories of spinach, 200 calories of steak, and you're like, okay, you can get iron from either one of these. Oh, the spinach isn't as absorbable, so you need more. That's not how it works. That's not how it works in the human body. You can only absorb 1.7% of the iron in spinach. So I always like to say it would be like if I wrote you a check and I was like, all right, here's a check for $1,000. And you're like, amazing. Thanks, Michelle. And you go to the bank and they're like, hey, she's got $17 in her bank account. And like, oh, it doesn't matter what the check is written for. It matters, can you access the funds? Just like it doesn't matter how much iron is in spinach or calcium is in kale. If your body can't actually use it, it is effectively useless to you, you know? So, and the same thing with grain. I mean, oats and seeds and all these things, they're very high in phytic acid. And we know phytic acid binds to calcium, iron. Iron is the number one vitamin or mineral efficiency worldwide, especially female athletes. And so, once again, I'm not saying you can't ever have some seeds or some oatmeal or whatever, but when we look at how we eat, how our athletes eat, are we eating, lots of steak and some liver and some, bone marrow, but mostly, or are we eating plates of pasta and bread? It's like, oh, I don't know why everyone's iron deficient. It's like, oh, call on me, I know. So yeah, the myplate.gov is a total disaster. I mean, if you want to become diabetic, you could do that. It's not going to make you feel full or satiated. It's not going to provide enough vitamins or minerals. It's going to be too many carbohydrates over time for most people. It is not, we have so much data on this that it's not based in science. It's political. It's religious. It's all kinds of nonsense. I'm actually on a committee advocating that we just get a low carbohydrate option added to the nutrition guidelines, just so we can, teach it, because most people like look at the guidelines and they're like, yeah, that's kind of garbage, but who cares? Why does it matter? And it matters because it's how we design our school nutrition. It's how we design every federal policy. Like, that's how we feed people in hospitals. That's how we feed people in prison. That's how we, feed low income, Meals on Wheels, things like that. So by having this horrible guideline, I feel like it continues just to contribute to metabolic illnesses across the United States.
One thing that stood out there was about the vegetables. We hear a lot of, okay, every young kid needs to have their broccoli, but there's a reason why a kid is like, no, I don't want that. Like, I
Mhm.
don't think I see one kid who's excited about eating their greens. But I actually was at a holistic doctor the other day, and I had told him that I had cut out spinach and kale several months back because I was really sensitive and getting rosacea, having digestive issues. And it was so refreshing to hear him say, oh, you must be sensitive to oxalates. And I have not once heard a doctor bring up oxalates, and not a lot of people are informed on what they are. So can you talk about some of the anti-nutrients and toxins that are in vegetables that dietitians aren't talking about?
Yeah. So how you want to think about anti-nutrients is, you know, nothing, nothing basically wants to be like the goal of life, is to live, to reproduce, right? So if you and I, let's say, went hunting and I stepped on a stick, a deer is going to like take off, like, oh crap, I'm out of here. But plants don't have the capacity to move, right? They're literally rooted into the ground. So over time, plants, they developed defense mechanisms basically to keep predators from eating them. That's why, oxalates specifically, if you just take like a bite out of a leaf of kale or spinach, it's very bitter, and so well, what oxalates are, I mean, they're basically just like small crystals. So we have several different anti-nutrients in plants. We have oxalates, lectins, glutens, things that basically can cause a reaction in people. They can cause inflammation. They can cause autoimmune reactions. A lot of people and this is what makes me really sad when people are told to follow these like vegan or vegetarian diets, and all of a sudden they're consuming lots of spinach and kale and peppers and things that they think, oh, this is going to be so good for my body. And all of a sudden they feel bloated, their joints hurt, and they maybe, like they have a rash or something. So, yeah, specifically, it's interesting, like spinach. I mean, spinach and kale and chard, those are one of the few ones we actually have several clinical trials that, oxalates cause kidney stones, that people directly having issues with their kidneys from consuming. And I mean, obviously, you'd have to consume quite a bit, but then unfortunately, you get people that are making these big spinach smoothies or kale juices or things like
Yeah,
that.
I used to
So,
be that,
so
regrettably.
it's see, and so it just almost seems like blasphemous though, because oh, these things are supposed to be so good for us, and but we have to, we just have to embrace, once again, truth that every species has a very species specific diet. My wife and I used to own a tortoise. She's now on a little tortoise farm with other tortoises. But Gertie the tortoise had a very specific diet. Her diet was leaves and kale. That's what she needed to make her body healthy. Our dog Jackson eats very different, right? He needs meats, he needs livers. Humans have a species specific diet. We are omnivores. We can absorb nutrition from animals and plants, but our system is set up just much more efficiently, much more effectively to run off animal based nutrition. And when we start eating a lot of these plants, especially the ones that have anti nutrients, you can start seeing a lot of issues. Many people improve some symptoms of like inflammation and have better like joint health when they remove the nightshades. Things like potatoes, peppers, tomatoes. A lot of people, like you said, even removing, things like spinach, chard, kale, start to feel a lot better. And that doesn't mean that, every person, all over has to remove vegetables all the time. I think, what I did was remove everything for a period of time and then kind of slowly add some stuff back in just to see like what your body reacts to. I'm totally fine. We actually grow some carrots. We eat a little bit of cabbage, do some berries, but I don't depend on that at all for like my overall nutrition. It's kind of like a side. So,
So, for athletes who want to explore the high protein, high fat, because I know a lot of them are focusing on carbs first at the
sure.
expense of decreasing everything else, how do they like ease into the transition, just to make sure their body can adapt, their gut microbiome can adapt, and they're just not like going from one extreme to the other?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that unless you're working with somebody. And certainly, if you went purely ketogenic, like if you're a very high carb athlete and you just dropped all your carbs, you're going to feel pretty awful for a while. So, there's different ways to do it. I definitely would recommend, do it during a off season or when you're not going to be, this is not something to do like right before competition or right before like a major tournament. Yeah, I think the first thing that I recommend is just start prioritizing protein. If you're the person that is used to eating just like a big bowl of oatmeal or pancakes or something, like add some protein. Have protein first. Have that kind of be, have some eggs in the morning, have some bacon, have something else. And then, potentially work on like reducing the amount of carbohydrates you're having. So you can kind of slowly, do that throughout your meals. And this is also another good opportunity. Like if you are able to work with a dietitian or a health coach or somebody that can guide you on how to do this. And of course, making sure somebody, it's somebody who understands low carbohydrate nutrition. Cause I think there's a potential for a lot of athletes just to feel a ton better. You recover better, you sleep better, your muscles are going to feel better, but it is a little bit of it is a transition. So yeah, I mean that would be my best advice is just, slowly increasing protein, slowly decreasing carbohydrates. And then, ideally you want to be just really focusing your carbohydrates kind of before, during, and after competition.
That's brilliant, and I think that'll be really helpful for everyone listening. Now, I want them to follow up with you. I know you have your children's book coming out. Are there any other projects that you want to tell the audience about?
Yeah. So the children's book I'm super excited about. It's with cartoon foxes and little fox gets type 2 foxabetes. And so how he's going to be able to reverse that. I also, I got to speak on a policy meeting board. So we're really hoping that by 2030, we have a low carbohydrate option added to the nutrition guidelines. So that's a committee that I've been on and I'm working on And yeah, I would say those are probably my 2 biggest, projects right now. It's my goal to continue to go to some conferences and to speak and just advocate. Yeah, and I'm always open. So we'll see what the future brings. Oh,
Awesome.
I guess
So,
I'm also training for a 100-mile race too. That's
oh,
that's
minor detail.
yeah, minor detail. The goal is to do the Brazos Spin 100 on December 2nd.
That is incredible and fueled by protein mainly and
Yes,
some
lots of beef.
strategically placed carbs, which is incredible. Now, before you go, I want to ask you about the fermented sourdough. I do want
Oh,
to
sure.
try that, but I was wondering, like, what are the benefits of that?
Yeah, so what we found is, I completely eliminated like any type of carbohydrates for a while, and then started to add back a few. And I added, and my body just wasn't doing very well with some of like the potatoes and sweet potatoes, and I could do a little bit of rice, but it was like, man, it'd be really great if I could do some bread. And I know some people can't, if they eat a piece of bread, it can be something that's a triggering or they binge. But for me, it was like, okay, I think this could be good for my activity and for my running. And so, we tried some stuff, but it was like, it didn't settle great in my stomach. And so my wife and I did some research, and we're like, we could do this ourselves. It could be a little bit of a process. But when you ferment things, I think that's something that throughout history, a lot of cultures would ferment vegetables, they would ferment grains. It makes it more easily digestible. It basically reduces the gluten. It's going to reduce any type of like phytic acid. So it just basically makes any nutrition that's in there going to be more easily absorbed in your body. And so, yeah, now that we kind of have the process going, it's a little intimidating to do your first time. Certainly if you have a farmer's market and you got someone else to do it, that's always a good option. But yeah, one, I found it settles on my stomach very easily, and two, I found it's just a great vehicle for fat. For somebody, for athletes, often we're needing 3,000 plus calories a day. And so it's just very easy to have, a piece of sourdough with lots of butter, lots of olive oil, something like that. And for me, I found it just digests really easy in my body.
I love it. I'm definitely gonna give that a try because it sounds really yummy, and I definitely want to start adding some breads back in.
Nice,
But yeah,
nice.
this was a really great conversation, a lot for everyone to think about. But I'm gonna include all of your links in the caption below. But where can everyone find you? Where are you hanging out the most?
Yeah, I'm probably on Instagram the most at Run Eat Meat Repeat. I'm on Twitter at Michelle Hurn RD. Yeah, the Dietitian's Dilemma, the book on Amazon. Hopefully, the Fox Family Food Fight, my children's book, will be up there. Thank you for holding up in the fall. I'm pretty stoked. We're just getting the illustrations done on that. And my website, thedietitiansdilemma.net. If you have any questions, you have any thoughts, you're potentially interested, I still do some consulting. Feel free to shoot me an email there.
Great. I'm sure you'll have a lot of people following up with some great questions. And guys, we hope you enjoyed the episode. Michelle, thank you again. And I will see everyone on next week's episode.